Alright, y'all, so today I want to make a very quick video to give you my thoughts on a wild bit of Beatles related history. That is my thoughts on the Paul is Dead conspiracy. The wild, worldwide, mainstream conspiracy that revolved around the idea that Paul McCartney, the famous member of the arguably the most famous band of all time, the Beatles, actually died. There was some kind of orchestrated plot behind the scenes to cover it all up, and people basically think that there was clues in their albums that would confirm the fact that Paul was really dead. The person playing the music and writing the music wasn't actually Paul McCartney. So just to give you my quick thoughts on all this, it's a very wild conspiracy. It's just something so bizarre. Imagine the fact that you're a famous celebrity and all of a sudden people are saying that you're dead. You know, you're not the real you. You were actually a cover up for the real person. Just like I said, I can't even imagine being in Paul's shoes when he was hearing about this conspiracy. And this conspiracy actually went really mainstream. It was talked about on radio shows, it was acknowledged in songs even after the fact. And all the Beatles talked about it at some point in their lives. Books were written about it, and even a short film was created following the myth and the conspiracy of Paul is dead. So in this video, kind of want to give you my thoughts on it, kind of give you the general premise of it, the history of it a little bit, and just kind of, like I said, in a non-scripted, off-the-top way, my thoughts on the Paul is Dead conspiracy that came from the Beatles. Now, you may be asking, well, what is actually the timeline? What is the scenario that people and tons of conspiracy theorists point to when they say Paul is dead? What is the generally accepted timeline? So I'll get into it. So apparently on November 9th, 1966, Paul and the rest of the band members, the Beatles, were in a recording session and crafting up tracks for the album that would eventually be called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. At some point during this session, Paul got into it with the other members. There was like a fiery, possibly bloody debate, and Paul just left the studio in a rage. And in particular, that morning when Paul left the studio, it was very bad weather conditions. It was very icy on the road. There wasn't really a lot of great visibility. But Paul left the studio in a rage, and kind of like I said, the generally accepted narrative. There's also other versions of this narrative. I'm going to kind of give you some of the generally accepted version timeline of events. Paul was driving down in his car and apparently got distracted by a meter maid by the name of Rita. At some point, he was at an intersection, possibly some other kind of road, and he didn't notice the lights had changed. And distracted by these two combinations, got into a horrific car accident, and it eventually killed Paul McCartney. Now, there's other versions too where this Rita person was like a hitchhiker and Paul picked her up. So I would assume that she died in the car accident with him. But that is the generally accepted narrative of events. And after the car accident, Paul is dead. And the Beatles were obviously shocked by this revelation. One of their founding members, right? One of their earliest members of the band has suddenly passed away in a tragic accident. So what do they do, right? Any reasonable person would announce that, one of their members is dead, possibly dissolve the band. Well, the other members figure that was out of the discussion. We cannot break up the Beatles, especially as they felt like they were at the height of their careers. This is when apparently MI5, the Secret Service of Britain, got involved and contacted the Beatles and concocted a wild plan. They felt like that they told the public that Paul was dead, it would create mass hysteria. People would lose their minds. People possibly would do things to themselves. It would create total chaos. So they concocted a plan alongside the other members, the surviving members of the Beatles, to find a cover-up for Paul McCartney, to get a replacement that looked just like him and just go on as normal. So they apparently found this person from a Paul McCartney look-alike contest. In some versions of the narrative, this individual was by the name of Billy Shears. Some other versions of the narrative also mention his name could have been William Campbell. But he apparently struck a very high resemblance to Paul McCartney, with a few, minor touch-ups, like, some plastic surgery and such. He was ready. And this look-alike Paul was eventually, put into the band. This was also, coincidentally, the band also announced the Beatles that they had quit live touring. And this was also a very easy cover-up for that fact that Paul was actually gone. And this look-alike fake Paul was in its place. And this is also kind of where the narrative and the timeline of the events gets a little bit weird. They would eventually craft and still release Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, and apparently the Beatles put subtle clues in their songs and their lyrics, even their album covers and artwork and photos. They would put subtle clues and kind of let fans down gently that Paul was actually dead, that the Paul that you see here on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is a fake. And that's kind of the generally accepted narrative of events. Now, obviously, there's so many holes with this and so many things that just would have to work and magically align for this conspiracy to actually be true. There's just tons of rebuttals to this wild Paul is dead conspiracy. But, like I said, it generally attracted widespread, acclaim, not maybe acclaim, but widespread attention. Tons of people were talking about it in 1966 to 1967, and again, the rumor kind of resurfaced in 1969. Now, I'm going to kind of go over some of the major clues people point out that prove that this theory, the Paul is dead conspiracy, is actually real. And I'll also kind of go into some of the little bit of history of events as well. So first we got, like I said, the alleged timeline suggests that Paul McCartney died in 1966. And there was tons of clues that fans apparently had found in 1967 with the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, specifically on the cover of that album. Now, that album is a very famous cover. It kind of, like I said, it's a really fantastic cover. It goes into the whole, kind of world mythology, kind of idea that this was a fake band that created this album, that Paul crafted this idea. Regardless, I'm getting off point. But people point out the fact that the Paul in this photo, number one, has a mustache. That was obviously right. That's not Paul. Paul wouldn't have a mustache. Number two, he was holding an instrument that was different from the other Beatles in the photo. All three of the other Beatles are holding brass golden instruments. Paul is holding a black wooden instrument. That has to symbolize something, right? That symbolizes death. Like I said, very strange, right? There's also like a kid on the kind of the bottom right of the photo of the collage, where he's holding a car, and people have said this car had weird red stained kind of windows. This is supposed to symbolize the fact that Paul was actually in an accident. Wild, right? And then there's a character kind of sitting above Paul and kind of the crowd of faces that's holding up his hand. And people have symbolized that that person holding up his hand is a subtle way of telling us that this Paul is not the real Paul. Also, there's kind of there's kind of in the, the album cover, there's a kind of bouquet of flowers and stuff that kind of make up the Beatles' name. But there's also a yellow bit of flowers that are kind of on the bottom right that kind of show off, at least if you look hard enough, make up the words Paul. Once again, another massive clue that Paul is apparently dead in the Beatles. If you look at also some of the other artwork that was included in the vinyl and some of the other sleeves, you kind of get a very cool image of the Beatles and their Sgt. Pepper's outfits, all of them kind of facing the camera. Now, people have pointed to the fact that there's a patch on the left shoulder of Paul McCartney's Sgt. Pepper's uniform that apparently reads, officially pronounced dead. So, of course, that had to be confirmation that Paul is actually dead. This isn't the real Paul that we're looking at. Also, if you look at the back cover, which featured the lyrics to the songs on the album, you get a very mysterious photo of the band, right? You get this one of Paul facing away while the other three are looking at the camera. Obviously, why is Paul facing away? That has to mean that this Paul is not the real Paul. This is a fake Paul. Another confirmation of the theory, allegedly. Another eerie coincidence is the fact that George Harrison is pointing at a lyric from "She's Leaving Home," allegedly, and I don't exactly remember the song exactly, but I think it's from "She's Leaving Home," which points at the lyric "Wednesday at 5 o'clock." And November 9th, 1966 happens to be a Wednesday. So, of course, this gives us the time of death, right? It must have happened at around 5 in the morning. Makes total sense. Also, another thing I forgot to mention on the front of the album, if you get a mirror and put it halfway through Ringo Starr's drums that feature on the Sgt. Pepper's cover, you'll get a very weird image that sort of basically reads out 119. So obviously the date Paul died, and apparently read out the letters he dead. So once again, confirmation, right? Paul died on November 9th, 1966, allegedly. And this is just a subtle way the band is giving us clues that Paul is actually dead. Wild things. And like I said, this was huge back in that time period, right? I mean, a lot of college campuses were giving a lot of radio, telephone calls from students and other things. It was a widely circulated topic during that time period that Paul McCartney might actually be dead. It actually ironically led to a spike in record sales because people would actually purchase the records to search for clues and also play the songs backwards and resulting the records being destroyed, so they have to purchase new records. Now, where are more clues that a lot of theorists point out to the fact that Paul McCartney is dead? Well, if you look at the next album they released, Magical Mystery Tour, the black person in the walrus costume has to be Paul, because he's the only one that looks different. So, of course, this is supposed to another subtle way that Paul is dead. Also, allegedly, the kind of star design for the Beatles name on the cover, if you flip the album artwork upside down, it allegedly, like I said, allegedly gives the number to the London mortuary. The person, I guess the people to call if a person's dead and get an autopsy, allegedly. So once again, another subtle clue that people are pointing out to the fact that Paul is really dead. Also, people point out to the fact that if you look at the sleeves and the little booklet inside the album's vinyl, there's like images of Paul McCartney where there's hands above him. So another subtle way that this is not the real Paul. And then we kind of go into the White Album. Actually, let me sidetrack a little bit. There's also a song on the album Magical Mystery Tour, of course, called the famous Strawberry Fields Forever. And people point out to the fact that allegedly near the end of the song, John is apparently reportedly saying that I buried Paul. That's what people have allegedly heard John saying at the end of that song, which we're going to get into that later, but turns out in the outtakes, and even if you listen to the song closely to this day, John is actually saying cranberry sauce, not that I buried Paul. Wild stuff. Then we get into the White Album. Now, there's obviously no clues on the album artwork, but if you get into the songs themselves, the most damning coincidence, right, allegedly, is on the song Revolution 9. If you play that song backwards, there's a clue that people have pointed out to the fact that allegedly Paul was dead. Like I said, very wild stuff. I think the lyric that people have kind of pointed out to when you play that record backwards is "Turn me on, dead man." A very wild and eerie thing. Like when John says number 9, if you play that reversed, it's "Turn me on, dead man," if I remember this correctly. And wild things that must confirm that Paul McCartney is dead. There's also some gibberish that you can look at, like between the Blackbird song and another song on the album that reportedly, like, this gibberish is somehow like representing the fact, it's supposed to be saying along the lines that Paul is dead as well. Also, you have the song Blackbird. This is another symbol of death. People are representing the fact that Paul did this song, so this is the fake Paul doing it. Another subtle way that they're letting us down. Also, the song Glass Onion, where John is just kind of making fun of a lot of people who look into his lyrics. He basically points to the fact that he mentions in the song that the walrus is Paul. So, of course, that person on the cover that he mentions, the war says Paul, that has to be a damn clue that Paul McCartney is dead. Wild stuff. Then we're going to move on to their final album they recorded together, which was Abbey Road. And another thing with their iconic classic album cover that album has, but there was apparently more damning clues people found that point to the fact that Paul is dead. If you look at the lineup of the Beatles and what they're wearing, this just confirms the fact that this looks like they went away. Like I said, this looks like this is what they were wearing for a funeral procession. For example, John is wearing all white. It looks like he's kind of the ring bearer of the funeral. You also have Ringo Starr, who's wearing all black. Very typical for a funeral, right? And then you also have Harrison kind of wearing a very casual look. If I remember correctly, people point out to the fact that Harrison was the grave digger who actually dug Paul's grave. And you got Paul himself, who, number one, is kind of out of step with the Beatles. Number two, has a cigarette in his right hand when Paul was allegedly left-handed. And the most damning bit of evidence is the fact that, well, Paul's not wearing any shoes, which represents the fact that he's a corpse. Obviously, all these clues point to the fact that Paul really died. This is all a big, massive cover-up. There's also a license plate for a vehicle in the Abbey Road album cover, which says 28 if, which basically is supposed to symbolize that if Paul was actually alive, he would have been 28 years old. And there's like tons of other lyrics as well that kind of go into this conspiracy. But those are some of the major ones that people have pointed to after the fact. There's also some lyrics people point out to with like songs like Paperback Writer and other things that kind of happened before 1966 and ended up in 1965 that kind of point out to more clues that Paul is really dead. Now, in terms of like the actual history, this conspiracy obviously kicked off massively in 1966, 1967. It was a wild idea. It was kind of like a widely circulated conspiracy starting in like a lot of American college campuses. Some radio college stations kind of brought in callers to come in and they would talk about it on the air. And it was such a wild theory that would pick up steam. Major publications would talk about it. And, tons of people, especially from the Apple label, like I think an Apple spokesperson had to come out that Paul was alive. He was very much alive. This is all fake. There was even people allegedly calling Paul McCartney. And Paul McCartney would respond, well, I'm obviously answering the phone, so I'm not dead. Obvious things, but it seems like these conspiracy theorists just looked for even more clues to the fact that this is all a massive cover-up. And then the theory kind of died and eventually picked up steam in 1969 again with Abbey Road coming out, with a review of the album coming out from a newspaper, and they kind of spun it. Instead of making a review, they would point to even more clues and damning evidence on the album cover that Paul is actually dead. And there was just, like I said, a widely circulated rumor in the late 60s to early 70s. Now time to get into a bit of the rebuttals and my overall thoughts on this wild theory. So, first bit of evidence. Apparently, Paul drove off on November 9th, 1966 and crashed his car. There is no evidence that Paul got into a car crash that specific day. Actually, during that time period, all four of the Beatles weren't even recording together in sessions. So the whole generally accepted narrative doesn't make any sense. Now, were there actually times that Paul McCartney was in an accident? There was. The image I'm kind of putting on the thumbnail for this video shows Paul having a badly bruised up lip and eyebrow and I think forehead. That is because at the very beginning of 1967, he actually did get into an accident. But he, like I said, was only kind of injured, had some facial issues. But like I said, nothing hugely major. That's the reason why Paul McCartney grew a mustache in 1967 when the Sgt. Pepper's album was made. And that's why he has a mustache on the album cover and artwork. Sorry for the siren in the background. I'm just kind of recording this. But like I said, Pretty damning evidence right there, right? In terms of the other things on the album cover, people point out the fact, the car, to me, I think that just looks like the grain of the photo, making it look like that way. In terms of like Ringo's drum, well, that's just pure coincidence, right? People also point out to the fact that the way Paul is placed on the album cover doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, why is he placed like that? And it must be because it's photoshopped, or it must be edited so that Paul would actually look like that and be there, which was entirely not the case. The band tried out various poses for the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, and that's the one that you just kind of generally liked. And of course, if you look at all these outtakes and these different photos, Paul's moving in all of them. So like I said, very much confirms that Paul was alive and he really did shoot this album cover. In terms of the back cover, people have pointed to that. That's just a cover. They did various different takes of that image, but that's just the one that the band all liked. In terms of the George Harrison pointing at that specific lyric, once again, kind of just an eerie coincidence, right? Looking too deep into things. Now we're going to kind of get into the patch that was on Paul McCartney's left shoulder that people pointed to as a damning piece of evidence and Paul's dead, right? Well, that patch actually stands for, and this is, to be fair, something that Paul McCartney kind of also got wrong when he spoke about it later in interviews. People said it stands for Officially Pronounced Dead, OPD, but actually the patch says OPP, which stands for Ontario Provisional Police Department. Provisional Police, excuse me. Paul McCartney later said it just stands for Ontario Police Department, so he wasn't too far off, but that's basically what that patch actually stood for. Now we're going to get into the other eerie things. Like I mentioned, on their next album with Magical Mystery Tour, people have pointed to the fact that the walrus that's all in black was, well, Paul, right? It was a damning bit of evidence that Paul was actually dead. Turns out this was probably all not true. The walrus was actually John all along. It was John in that walrus costume. What about the number that was allegedly in that Beatles star design on the album cover then? Well, number one, there's not really a number if you look at it, right? It's just, like I said, one of those things. If you're looking for clues as conspiracy theories, even if there's actually clues, you're going to probably find them. So it was probably all made up. People also point to the fact on some of the videos and artwork that there's allegedly an image of the band playing outside, and there's like some shoes, and Paul's not wearing shoes again. People pointing to the fact that why does Paul keep not wearing shoes? And the most likely reason is just because he thought it was too hot. He didn't want to wear his shoes that day. The red gleam of the shoes people have represented to say it was blood, which is probably not the case. It was probably just a reflection of the color from the drum onto the shoes. Now we got to get into more damning rebuttals, right? And we're going to go into the White Album. People point to the fact that on Glass Onion, right, John mentions that, the walrus was Paul. John was completely trolling people. I mean, the reason why I Am a Walrus, the song was made on their last album, is because John felt that people were looking into his lyrics too deeply. So he just made a very much nonsense song with tons of nonsense lyrics that are not meant to be super analyzed. And then people still found ways to analyze that song. So he kind of made Glass Onion as a little bit of a response. Once again, just completely trolling the audience, just making fun of the fact and just saying Paul was the walrus as a complete joke, which in fact, John was most likely the walrus all along. What about the Revolution 9 smoking gun? To be fair, that's just a very eerie coincidence. It's just, like I said, when you play the record backwards, it's just a really weird thing. I think John commented on, said that, he just didn't even know that was there. He doesn't play his records backwards, which makes total sense, right? And then we got to go into the Abbey Road cover situation. Once again, with Paul, he's not wearing shoes. This is most likely due to the fact that, apparently Paul was not wearing sandals that day. He felt his feet were too hot. He just took them off for the cover photo. And, they did, once again, various takes of cover photos. They were also kind of in a rush to shoot that day because they had a police officer holding off traffic in the very busy London streets. So they had to very quickly shoot this album cover. They had tried to get the Volkswagen that's in the album cover to move, but they couldn't find the owner, so it was just kind of left in the photo. And they just happened to take a really nice, very good-looking album cover photo. Probably the most famous album cover photo of all time. So once again, eerie coincidences, and like I said, how the Beatles are all dressed, it's just how they were dressed for that day, how their individual styles stood out to people. There's nothing deep inside of it, right? So like I said, this is some of the rebuttals and my overall opinions on some of the clues and tons of smoking guns that conspiracy theorists have pointed to over the years with the Paul was dead conspiracy. And of course, later on in interviews, all of the Beatles have spoke about it. The Apple spokesperson, even in 1969, when he was asked again, Paul very much is alive. He responded, he's very much alive and healthy person. Even when Paul was kind of in retreat and on a Scotland farm, a reporter kind of snuck on his farm and got some unflattering footage of him. So in response, for the negatives in the footage, he did an interview with him, and Life posted this interview, basically confirming the fact that Paul is very much alive. Even though conspiracy theorists, for whatever reason, even in that Life cover issue of Paul, apparently if you slightly move the cover page, there's a car ad right behind it. So that's got to represent that Paul was killed in a car accident, right? Complete nonsense, right? Complete nonsense. But Paul, of course, even himself has said many times in interviews that this is all not true. He's very much alive. This is very much Paul McCartney and, very much himself. He would respond to phone calls. To be fair, the whole thing did cause him early on a little bit of paranoia, which I got to feel bad for the guy. I mean, like I said, it's a wild conspiracy to hear that all of a sudden you're dead and the person that you really are is not actually you. So like I said, very wild stuff. But Paul has kind of had fun of it. I mean, later on too, I think in his solo career, he released a Paul is Live album, and he basically made fun of it with a parody of the Abbey Road cover and the name itself. I mean, Paul is Live. That's obviously a very funny rebuttal to the Paul is dead conspiracy. But yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a very popular, wide-ranging conspiracy that's spanned on for decades. Even to this day, some people believe has credibility. I think personally, it's a completely dumb and stupid conspiracy, but I do find a lot of fun in it. I think it's a fun bit of Beatles trivia. I find enjoyment in talking about it, to be honest. It's one of those very wild conspiracies. But just like I said, especially in this age of false media and false information, it's very important to know that this is just, like I said, a fun theory. This is not actually meant to be super real with super credible evidence. This is all just a giant fun theory conspiracy. And if you just treat it like that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, right? I even like to entertain the idea maybe Paul was dead. But of course, when you look at all the facts and all the real credible information, obviously it's completely false. But, I think it's a fun, wild bit of conspiracy and a little bit of fun history with the Beatles. I even think it's funny how John kind of, when they were kind of dissing, Paul and John were kind of dissing each other on their solo albums. John even made kind of a lyric that was in a way oh, these freaks out there think you're dead, which obviously was a commentary on this whole Paul is dead conspiracy and all that, which I think is a hilarious rebuttal to that whole situation. But yeah, overall, I think it's a fun little conspiracy and theory, but like I said, nothing to be taken too seriously. Just a fun bit of lore and history with the Beatles. Alright, y'all, so I just wanted to make a very quick and interesting off-the-top thoughts on video on the whole Paul is dead conspiracy. Hopefully y'all have a nice day. Make sure to stay safe. Peace.